was hoping to get some GoPro B-roll, but it's too cold. My camera just dies immediately. This is Yale Blue 32, a new double braid rope from Yale Cordage. It is truly a double braid. I know if you see a fine cover like this, you might think that it's another Kern Mantle rope, but this is a double braid with a 32 strand cover. It has a braided core, which means you have a lot of options for how you can splice this rope, which is what I am super excited about. I haven't climbed on it a whole bunch, but it feels really, really nice. It's super static, and this is the 11.7 version with the yellow fleck. What sets this apart from the normal 11.5 is that it has 3 strands inside of the braided core that I think will help keep it a little bit rounder, especially if you're running it with the OG rope flattener here, the Singing Tree rope runner, because this thing squishes ropes and has been a problem with ropes. Like over here, the other side of my anchor line is Yale XTC 48, which flattens real bad if you use it with the rope runner. But so far, this Blue 32 is working fantastically. It's a beautiful rope. I had a lot of fun splicing it, so now we'll just cut to some tips that I have for splicing this beautiful rope. So here's some tips for you for splicing Blue 32. Here we have the 11.7 variety with the yellow fleck. Usually I would be at my splicing bench, but as you can see, it is a little occupied with sewing stuff. So anyways, the first thing is measurements. If you're going to do any kind of core diminished splice, you want to make sure you have plenty of cover, especially since this is a more finely woven cover. It will not elongate the same as a regular 24 strand when you taper the cover. So you want to have plenty of cover. So the first thing I do is, instead of 1 fid length, I do a fid length plus a short when I'm making my initial mark on the cover. Secondly, after we make our mark for our eye at about 3.5 inches, when you go to set your stopper knot, I set my stopper knot, I give myself a little bit more extra space because, like I said, because this cover is so finely woven, it's harder to compress. So when we're pulling our core out, to have enough space to work with, instead of doing the regular 5 fid lengths, I would prefer to add just 1 more, bringing us to 6, so that we have plenty of space to work with when we're moving the cover back and forth to splice this rope. The second thing that'll cause a lot of frustration with a really finely woven cover like this is extracting the core. On a 24 strand, you know, the cover's the cover is much less dense, so it's much easier to split the yarns to extract the core, whereas on this it can be a little bit more difficult. So what I do is I pull the core out and pre-taper the core to make it easier to extract. So since I like to pre-taper the core, I'm going to use this 1/4 inch fid that I would usually use for extraction to ply open the rope a little bit at the extraction point so that I can get my Sharpie and more easily press it through the cover to mark the core. Now I can pull the core out and I'll get my clothespin, which is my preferred method to keep the core from unwinding itself. And now when I pull my core out, I can see my mark number 1, and now I can make my marks from here so that I can taper the core before I extract it at my extraction point. Sometimes to make the marking easier, you want to use something to pin the cover back so that you have plenty of space to work with. I'm just using my fid pusher. So that's our number 1. Number 2 is going to be here. And then number 3 We might not quite have enough space for number 3. Let's see here. Plus a short. Oh, we're just a tad shy. I bet I can get that little extra bit out. That ought to be enough. Alright, so our long plus a short. And that brings us to our Mark 3. So, the splices that I tested were with a half diminished core, which means I removed, you can see these are woven in paired strands. So that means that I removed a strand from each of those pairs to diminish the core by half. It's difficult, but if you try to diminish it by taking the whole paired set, just taking 4 of those, you'll lose the braid and then you won't get a nice result in the end. So if you're going to diminish a core at all, you want to pull only singled strands from these pairs instead of the whole pair. Otherwise the core falls apart and you can't really use it. For my other splice I did a half diminished core, but for this lanyard that I'm making, I'm only going to be doing a quarter diminished core. So I'm just going to remove 4 strands total. This is a 16 strand core. So I'm just going to remove 4 of these strands to only diminish it by a quarter so we can have a nice strong splice, but it's not going to be as slim as it could be. Now I have my 4 strands marked for tapering, but this is the hardest part in my opinion of this splice. So for this splice we're going to be doing a quarter diminished splice, but down here I have a sample section of core that I've marked as if we were going to do a half diminished splice. The splices that I tested were half diminished splices, and I got a result of about 4,200 pounds for those splices. So the quarter diminished splice will be a little bit stronger. Something I do when I mark the taper is I mark the bottom of the strands. So this is the end going towards the end of the rope. In the pairs, I mark the bottom strand in that pair. The reason that it's important to me to mark the bottom strand in that pair is so if we're doing a fully diminished splice, there's an issue we run into when we're tapering this where these strands can bunch up if you pull them from the bottom. But if that's an issue that you're having, if you're having a problem with pulling these and then having the pairs stay up like that, if they're staying stuck out, something you can do is cut them all down here, the ones that you're removing, and then since you marked the bottom strand, you can look at the weave up here and identify the bottom strand and then pull it from this end of the rope and keep pressure on the bottom side, and then that'll prevent these strands from bunching and getting caught, and it makes your splice probably less strong. And so sometimes, yeah, you can see they're laying back down, but sometimes we get ones like this. And every once in a while you can milk them back in and they lay back down pretty nice. But if it gets pulled too far, you'll just stay with like a picked loop that's stuck up here. And that can be irritating. So one way to mitigate that is cut it at the bottom, pull it from the top. But if you're only doing 4 strands like this, it's kind of hard to do that because we're only removing 4 of the bottom strands, so it's kind of hard to identify which is which over at the end of the rope here. So what you can do instead is you just got to keep really nice pressure on the end of the rope here while you're pulling it out. So something that we can do here to avoid that bunching is since we only have 4 marked here and we're not going to be able to identify which of those is the 4 up at the top if we were to cut them at the bottom and try to pull from the top. What we can do to keep pressure up here and still be able to pull these without everything getting bunched up in here is we can taper the end here by removing all of the bottom strands, and then we have only the top strands up here. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm just gonna do them in a line and pop them all out. So we're just grabbing all of the bottom strands and kind of pre-tapering the end of this rope, which I personally like for when you pull it through with a fid. Or a wire fid, it makes everything go a lot smoother when you're burying the core. But if we just pre-taper here and remove all of our bottom strands, you can see I'm only grabbing the bottom strand in the pairs. So boom, we got just about all of the bottom strands. Now we're gonna clip that back with our paper clip so it doesn't unravel more. Now, when we go to pull these strands, we can keep pressure down at this end of the rope without keeping pressure on the 4 strands that are going to get pulled, and that will make it so that things don't get quite as bunched up in the cover here. So there, now we have our side by side. We have the 1/4 diminished on top and the 1/2 diminished on the bottom. Alright, now we can get these examples out of the way. Look at that beautiful cover of the 11.5. Now, since we did our tapering, I'm just gonna cut these off. Not all the way short, I kind of like to leave them a little fluffy until closer to the end. But since we did our tapering before we extracted the core at all, that's going to make our core extraction much easier. So now we're going to milk the core back into the rope. And now, when we go to extract our core here, it's going to be a lot easier because the core's already been diminished a little bit, so we have less that we have to pull out through such a tiny hole. Now, it may be kind of hard to see, but in the 11.7 variety of Blue 32, we have 3 twisted core strands that kind of make this rope a little bit rounder and give it that added diameter. We need to extract those, similar to splicing tachyon. Alright, we got our core tapered and then cover tapered by 50%, which is standard for a class 1 splice. Now it's time to start using the wire fid and pulling things through each other. I don't like using tape, so when I use my fids, it's really only to set my wire fid. Alright, now right around here is where my last tip kind of comes into play. When I was talking about earlier, when you make your first measurement, doing a fid and a short instead of just a fid length. The reason I like to do that is so that you can get an exact length to make this taper here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut off our extra strand on the blue and get all this stuff snugged up. Alright, so we have our crossover snugged up nice and tight. Now what I'm going to do is milk this in and then mark it for where I need to cut it off. So I'm going to milk the core down over the cover and see, because we added that short fid, we actually have some cover left over here protruding out of the core instead of it just feeding right back in. So to get that really nice taper here, we're going to mark that there. I'll milk it one more time, just, you know, measure twice, cut once. Then I'll pull that out. We're just going to snip it off there. Spread it out all nice. And do our about 3-inch taper. There we go. Now, when we snug it back into the core, should line up really nicely, and we can kind of test how it feels to make sure that that taper feels really nice and uniform, so that the splice will feel uniform and not like there's a thin spot in our rope. That's the most important part about doing any kind of diminished splice like this, is that you want this crossover to be perfect for it to feel completely uniform in diameter. So we'll just play over it a couple times to make sure that feels the way we like, and then we'll be able to trim off this excess and suck it back up into the rope.
Well, we can keep our eyes upon
Alrighty, time to pull it all together.
or we can find our fears among the tears that will fall when the meadows cry, cry. Real ideas, much too much to think of. We need all the help we can get, and I know we need all the time that we've got, and I know we need all the love we can give. It will be here when we're gone. It will be here when we're gone.
Just this ratchet strap on a board is my favorite way to pull and set eyes on splices, because I don't really like swinging all my body weight into it. I'd prefer to just do it with a device instead. And while I have it under tension, I'm just going to feel throughout the splice, especially in my crossover area, to make sure that we don't have a diameter inconsistency. We want everything to be really nice and smooth. All done, time for some whipping. There we go, there's our finished splice in 11/7 blue 32. One of my favorite things about this rope is how many ways you can splice it. So here we have a quarter diminished splice, and I'll be using this for a lanyard. First climb on my beautiful new blue 32 lanyard. Setting up this technical fell here. We got this big willow. Half of it's broken out towards the train tracks. I thought about cutting that free from up here, but I kind of hate doing that in the tree. It's just finicky. It's hard to cut near them fibers. And plus, you know, it's gonna jump back towards me when I cut it, so I'd have to stay on that side. And even then, it's not a perfect plan, so I've felled plenty of snags like this before. I'd much prefer to cut it from the ground, so I have it. It's very stuck. We pulled that with the skid steer and it didn't go anywhere. So for an extra piece of safety, I got it tied up to this other stem here. So I'll cripple this tree to fell it this way, and then the skid steer will be able to break it free and pull it the rest of the way out into the field. But yes, first climb, and I'm loving it. Feels very smooth in the notch glide. Love the notch glide. Huge thanks to Yale and Eric for sending me those ropes. I've really loved splicing them, and I'm really excited to climb with this as a lanyard. I think a lanyard is the ultimate test for a rope to see how long it can last. But thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.